Ethan is 29 years old. 6 months ago, his biggest financial decision was whether to get the $12 burrito bowl or the $9 one. Today, he has $2.4 million sitting in a brokerage account because the startup he'd been quietly grinding for got acquired. And his equity, the equity everyone told him was probably worthless, was suddenly worth more than his entire extended family had earned across 3 generations combined. He thought the hard part was over. The payout was the reward. He was wrong. The hard part was just getting started. It had nothing to do with spreadsheets or tax brackets. It started the moment his father called and asked, almost casually, whether Ethan could maybe help his brother with his truck payment, just this once. And Ethan said yes, because how could he say no? He had $2.4 million. What kind of person says no to family with that kind of money sitting in an account? 8 months later, Ethan had paid off his brother's truck, covered his cousin's wedding deposit, quietly Venmo'd his aunt rent money twice, and fielded a phone call from an uncle he hadn't spoken to in 6 years, who wanted to know if he'd be interested in investing in his friend's restaurant concept. He had given away almost $350,000, not because he wanted to, because he didn't know how to want anything else without becoming a completely different and much colder person. The money that was supposed to buy him freedom had bought him a full-time unpaid job as the family bank. And there was no HR department, no resignation letter, no exit interview. There was just Thanksgiving coming up in 6 weeks and the dread of what his father was going to ask him in front of everyone. My name is Peak, and I spend way too much time thinking about the invisible mechanics of money. The parts nobody warns you about because nobody profits from warning you. And today we're not talking about how to get rich. Nobody tells you happens after you get rich, specifically inside your own family. How the psychology of sudden wealth quietly destroys relationships that took decades to build, if you don't understand the trap before you're standing inside it. If you've ever had a windfall, a raise, an inheritance, an equity payout, anything that changed your numbers faster than it changed your family's expectations. Or if you're building toward that moment and want to walk in with your eyes open, hit subscribe. Because this is the conversation nobody has until it's already gone wrong. Here's the thing, nobody tells you about sudden money. You think the challenge is going to be financial. You think you're going to spend your first year worrying about diversification and tax loss harvesting and whether your advisor is any good. And sure, that stuff matters. But researchers who study lottery winners and inheritance recipients have found something that should terrify anyone. A significant percentage of sudden wealth recipients report that their family relationships got measurably worse after the money arrived. Not better, not neutral, worse. Studies tracking large lottery winners have found elevated rates of family conflict, estrangement, and even lawsuits between relatives within just a few years of the win. The National Endowment for Financial Education has spent decades studying this exact phenomenon, and their research consistently shows the same pattern. Sudden wealth doesn't reveal new problems in a family. It takes every problem that was already quietly humming underneath the surface. Every resentment, every old sibling rivalry, every unspoken score being kept since childhood, and it turns the volume up to 11. Money doesn't create family dysfunction. Money is a microphone. It just makes the dysfunction that was already there impossible to ignore. Let's talk about why this happens. Because understanding the mechanism is the only way to survive it, without either losing your money or losing your family, because those are the two failure states, and most people assume you have to pick one. The first thing that happens is what psychologists call the fairness paradox. Before Ethan had money, his family related to him through a shared economic reality. Nobody had much slack, so nobody expected much slack. They were all playing the same game, roughly the same rules, roughly the same stakes. The moment you have a windfall, that shared reality shatters, but only for you. Everyone else is still playing the old game. And here's the part that catches people off guard. In their mind, they haven't changed. You have. From where they're sitting, you're the same son, the same brother, the same cousin they've always known. Except now you have resources they don't have. And resources, in the logic of family, have always been shared. Remember when your dad fed you for 18 years without invoicing you? Remember when your brother let you crash on his couch for 4 months after you lost a job? Family has always operated on an informal ledger of mutual support, and that ledger doesn't have an expiration date, just because your bank balance changed. So when you don't immediately open the tap, when you hesitate, when you say something like, "let me think about it," what they hear isn't a person exercising financial caution. What they hear is a betrayal of the unspoken contract that has governed your relationship since birth. You didn't just get money. You got accused, silently, invisibly, of thinking you're better than them. The second mechanism is what I call the reference point collapse. And this one is purely mathematical, but it explains almost all the emotional chaos. Before the windfall, everyone in the family, including Ethan, judged financial decisions against a shared baseline. A $500 gift felt generous. A $2,000 loan felt like a big ask. Those numbers meant something because they were being measured against incomes that were all roughly similar. The instant you have $2.5 million, your internal reference point for what constitutes a lot of money recalibrates almost overnight. You start thinking in percentages of your total net worth. $2,000 is 0.08% of your portfolio. It feels like nothing to you. But your brother's reference point hasn't moved. To him, $2,000 is still a month and a half of rent. It's still enormous. So when he asks for it and you hesitate, he's not being greedy from his frame of reference. He's asking for something genuinely significant to him, and your hesitation feels wildly disproportionate and cold, because he has no idea that in your head, that number now rounds to zero. Neither of you is wrong about the math. You're just running two completely different reference points through the same conversation. And nobody has told either of you that the reference points have diverged, so the conflict feels personal when it's actually just arithmetic. The third mechanism, and this is the one that actually breaks families, is what researchers call identity threat. Money in a family isn't just money. It's a scoreboard for an unspoken competition that's been running since childhood. Who is the smart one? Who is the successful one? Who is going to make the parents proud? Who is going to need help forever? When one son suddenly has more money than the rest of the family combined, it doesn't just change that person's bank account. It reorders the entire emotional hierarchy of the family without anyone's consent. Ethan's brother, the one who felt like the responsible one, can suddenly feel like the money made a mockery of all that careful planning. Meanwhile, the parents, who spent decades believing their role was to provide for their children, now face the disorienting experience of one son having resources that dwarf their own life savings. That's not a small psychological adjustment. That's an entire identity. Provider, protector, having the rug pulled out from under it. Nobody articulates any of this out loud. Instead, it comes out sideways, as passive comments about how you've changed. As sudden requests wrapped in resentment, as an uncle who used to love you turning cold for reasons he can't quite name even to himself. Now, let's get into the actual mechanics of how this destroys money and relationships simultaneously, because I want you to see the compounding math of saying yes without a framework. Say your family has 12 people in your immediate orbit: parents, siblings, a few cousins, an aunt or uncle who's always struggling. If each of them asks you for an average of $15,000 over the first 2 years, that's $180,000 gone. But it's never actually an average request. It's never evenly distributed. The most emotionally manipulative or financially desperate relative in your family will always ask for the most. And they'll ask first, because they've spent a lifetime learning exactly which buttons produce a yes. So realistically, one or two people absorb 60 or 70% of that $180,000. And the rest of your family watches that happen and recalibrates their own asks upward, because now there's a precedent. If you gave your brother $80,000, why wouldn't you give your cousin $40,000? Every yes isn't a single transaction. It's a new data point that resets the baseline expectation for everyone watching. And in a family, everyone is always watching. Here's where it turns genuinely dark. Financial psychologists who study sudden wealth recipients describe a phenomenon called the resentment inversion. And it's the cruelest part of this entire trap. You would think that giving money generates gratitude. It often does the opposite. The relative who receives $80,000 doesn't spend the next 5 years feeling grateful. Within about 18 months, the psychological baseline resets, and the money that felt like a miracle starts to feel like an entitlement. If you ever say no to a subsequent request, the relationship doesn't get evaluated against the total generosity. It gets evaluated against the most recent interaction. You become, in their memory, the guy who wouldn't help. And the $80,000 evaporates from the emotional ledger entirely. Meanwhile, you're sitting there feeling used, wondering how you went from generous benefactor to villain in the space of one conversation. And the honest answer is that generosity without a framework doesn't build gratitude. It builds dependency. And dependency, when interrupted, produces rage, not appreciation. This is exactly where Ethan found himself in month 9. His uncle, the one who wanted investment in the restaurant concept, stopped calling to check in on him and started calling only when he needed something. His brother, once grateful for the truck payment, began mentioning offhand that Ethan could probably afford to help with a down payment on a house too. And his mother started every phone call not with "how are you," but with a soft, careful lead-in that Ethan had learned to recognize instantly as the opening line of a request. He wasn't imagining it. He was watching, in real time, the exact resentment inversion the researchers describe. And he had no idea how to stop it without becoming, in his own mind, the villain of his own family story. So what's the alternative? Because I'm not telling you to become cold, and I'm definitely not telling you to cut off your family. I'm telling you that the entire framing of help or don't help is the wrong question, and it's the question that destroys people. The right framework, the one that actually protects both your wealth and your relationships, is built on 3 specific structural decisions. And I want to walk through each one because the details matter enormously here. The first structural decision is separating gifts from loans, explicitly, in writing, every single time, no exceptions. Most family financial disasters happen in the fog of ambiguity, where money changes hands and nobody actually says out loud whether it's a gift or a loan. So both parties get to privately believe whatever version is convenient for them. The giver thinks of it as a loan because that feels more responsible. The receiver thinks of it as a gift because that feels less humiliating. 18 months later, when you gently ask about repayment, you discover you've been having 2 completely different conversations this entire time. And now there's a fight about something that was never actually agreed upon in the first place. The fix is uncomfortable but simple. Before any money moves, you say the sentence out loud. I want to be really clear. This is a gift. There's no expectation of repayment, and I never want either of us to think about this again. I'm happy to do this as a loan. Here's the amount. Here's the timeline. Let's write it down so neither of us has to rely on memory. That single sentence, spoken before the money moves, prevents 90% of the resentment that would otherwise build for years. The second structural decision is creating what I call a family giving budget. A hard, predetermined annual number that you decide in a calm moment, not in the heat of an emotional phone call. Say Ethan decides he's comfortable giving away $50,000 a year to family, total, across everyone. That number isn't a suggestion. It's a boundary that exists before anyone asks for anything. Which means when a cousin calls with a request, Ethan isn't making a decision about whether he values that cousin. He's making a decision about whether this particular request fits inside a budget he already committed to. That reframe changes everything, because it converts an emotionally loaded yes or no decision about love into a neutral, almost boring budgeting question. I've already allocated this year's giving, but let's talk about next year is a sentence that protects the relationship and the boundary simultaneously, because it doesn't reject the person. It just cites a policy that predates their specific request. The third structural decision, and this is the one almost nobody does, is refusing to fund lifestyle, but being genuinely generous with funding leverage. There's an enormous difference between covering your brother's rent every month indefinitely, which creates a permanent subsidized lifestyle he'll never be motivated to escape, and paying for him to get a certification that doubles his earning potential, which is a one-time investment in his actual independence. The first kind of giving makes you the family's permanent safety net, and permanent safety nets remove the urgency that drives people to solve their own problems. The second kind of giving actually reduces how much you'll need to give over time, because you're solving the underlying capacity problem instead of endlessly patching the symptom. When someone asks for money, the question isn't, can I afford this? With Ethan's numbers, he can almost always afford it. The question is, does this purchase their independence, or does it purchase their dependence on me specifically? That single distinction will save you hundreds of thousands of dollars and dozens of relationships over a decade. I also want to address the parents specifically, because that relationship carries a different emotional weight than siblings or cousins. If your parents genuinely need financial help, that's not the trap I'm describing. That's exactly what wealth is supposed to be for. The trap is helping them in a way that creates confusion about who is actually in charge of their own financial decisions going forward, or helping in a way that becomes a permanent monthly transfer with no boundary and no endpoint, which quietly shifts their entire retirement plan onto your balance sheet without either of you explicitly agreeing to that. The fix here is the same principle, structure, and clarity, even with parents, especially with parents. A one-time contribution to a retirement account, clearly defined, is different from becoming their unofficial and unlimited pension plan. Here's the final piece of this, the psychological piece, because the frameworks only work if you can actually hold the line emotionally. And this is where most people fail, even with a perfect plan on paper. You have to make peace with the fact that some people in your life will be disappointed in you, and that their disappointment is not proof that you did something wrong. It's proof that you have a boundary. And boundaries are, by definition, the things other people bump into when they want something from you that you're not giving. The version of you that says yes to every request isn't actually more loving. That version is just more conflict avoidant. And conflict avoidance feels like kindness in the short term, while it quietly generates far more damage over the long term. because it trains your family to see you exclusively as a resource rather than as a person with your own priorities. The families who navigate sudden wealth successfully, and there are plenty who do, aren't the ones who gave away the most money. They're the ones who got comfortable, sometimes uncomfortably comfortable, with the fact that love and money are not the same currency, and that you can be a deeply generous, deeply loving family member while still saying, calmly and without guilt, "I've thought about this, and the answer is no, not this time." Ethan figured this out about 14 months in, right around the time his uncle asked him to co-sign a loan for the restaurant concept. He said no, not coldly, not with a lecture, just clearly with a number attached. "I've already allocated what I'm comfortable giving this year, and I'm not going to co-sign anything, but I'd genuinely love to help you build out a business plan." His uncle was upset for about 3 weeks. Then he stopped bringing it up. His brother, the one with the truck, still calls him every Sunday, and neither of them has mentioned money in 9 months. Because there's nothing left to negotiate, the boundary already did its job. Thanksgiving came, and his father did ask about helping with something. And Ethan said the sentence he'd practiced in the mirror, calmly, warmly, and completely without apology. And the table didn't erupt. It just moved on to the next topic. Because clarity, it turns out, is far less dramatic than everyone fears it will be. The money didn't have to cost Ethan his family. The silence around the money was always the actual threat. The families that survive a windfall aren't the ones with the least conflict. They're the ones who stopped pretending the conflict wasn't happening and finally put words and numbers around it. If this helped you think differently about what wealth actually requires of you, make sure to subscribe, because we're going to keep having the conversations that nobody else is willing to have.